My name is Eleanor Parker. I'm 78 years old, and for the first time in my life, I stood in front of a church full of people and realized no one wanted to speak about the man I had been married to for more than 50 years. Walter Parker, my husband, lay in a polished coffin at the front of the room, his hands folded like he was finally at peace. But the air was heavy, and what I saw on the faces of our children, neighbors, and even the pastor was not grief. It was something closer to relief. The silence in that church could have broken glass. I waited for anyone, to stand and say a few words, but they all kept their heads down. Clara, my daughter, pressed her lips together so tight they turned white. Michael, my son, stared at the floor like he couldn't bear to lift his eyes. I realized in that moment they were waiting on me. So I walked up, my knees stiff and shaking, but my back straight. I stood at the podium, hands gripping the wood, and opened my mouth. And what came out wasn't the truth. I painted a picture of Walter as a kind man, a loyal husband, a proud father who sacrificed for his family. Words people expected to hear. Words that made strangers nod politely. But as those lies left my mouth, my heart thundered.
My palms sweat.
Because I knew the man lying in that coffin was no saint. He was cruel. He was violent. He broke me in ways I don't like to remember. And yet, I chose to give him the kind of story he never earned.
Why?
Why would I lie for a man who left scars on me and my children? Maybe it was habit. Maybe I wanted to protect my kids one last time. Or maybe it was because I had grown so used to hiding the truth, I didn't know how to stop. But as my voice carried across that church, I saw the confusion in my children's eyes. They knew I was lying. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just rewriting Walter's life. I was betraying my own. And that's where I need to take you back. Back to when it all began. Back to the girl I used to be, before I ever knew the weight of his hands or the sound of his rage. Because to understand why I stood there lying, you need to know what led me to this pulpit in the first place. I'll tell you everything, but I warn you, it's not pretty. It's a story of love that rotted, of choices that cost me years I'll never get back, and of children who grew up under shadows darker than I ever meant for them. And it all began the day I said yes to Walter Parker. Stay with me, because the cracks in this story are only starting to show. I was 19 the first time Walter kissed me. Back then, he was tall, confident, and full of promises. He wasn't rich, but he had the kind of swagger that made you believe he was going somewhere. My parents didn't like him. My father said, "That boy's got sharp eyes, Ellie. He's looking out for himself, not for you." But I was young, and like most young women, I thought I knew better. Walter made me feel like I was the only girl in the world. He'd take me dancing at the VFW hall, bring me flowers he probably stole from someone's yard, and whisper about the life we would build together. A house, children, Sunday dinners. The American dream wrapped up in his crooked smile. When he asked me to marry him, I didn't hesitate. We stood in front of a judge in a plain courthouse ceremony because Walter said big weddings were a waste of money. I remember looking into his eyes, believing with all my heart that he was my forever. But forever is a tricky word. My mother cried that day, not tears of joy, but the kind that sting your throat and burn your eyes. She tried to hug me one last time before we left and whispered, "You can still walk away." But I didn't. I chose him. And maybe that was the first mistake that shaped the rest of my life. Because not long after the wedding, I saw the first crack in Walter's perfect mask. It was small at first, but once a crack appears, it only gets bigger. The first bruise came 3 months after we married. I still remember it because it was so unexpected, so unreal. I thought I must have imagined it. We were in the kitchen, arguing about money. Walter had spent his paycheck on beer and cards with his friends. I asked how we were supposed to pay rent. His face darkened, his jaw clenched, and before I could finish my sentence, his hand flew across my cheek. The sound echoed in the room. My skin burned, my eyes watered, but the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the look in his eyes. Cold. Unapologetic. Like I was just another object he owned. He muttered something about me nagging, then walked out the door. I sat on the floor, hand pressed to my cheek, telling myself it was a one-time mistake. That he was tired, stressed, maybe even drunk. I told myself love was forgiveness. The next day, he came home with flowers. Cheap ones from the gas station, but he held them out like they were gold. He kissed my forehead, told me he loved me, and promised it would never happen again. And I believed him. But the promise didn't last. A month later, we argued again. This time about groceries. He didn't hit me, but he picked up a plate and smashed it against the wall, inches from where I stood. The shards flew everywhere, one cutting my arm. I remember pressing a towel to the wound, shaking while he paced the room.
And here's the thing.
By then, I was pregnant, carrying our first child. And I knew in my bones that I wasn't the only one at risk anymore. That night, lying awake with my hand over my belly, I realized something chilling. The baby inside me would grow up hearing this violence. And as I drifted into uneasy sleep, one thought haunted me. What if this wasn't just my mistake to live with? What if I had just cursed my child? 2. Our daughter, Clara, was born on a rainy spring morning. I held her tiny hand in mine and promised her I would protect her. I meant it. I wanted so badly to shield her from the storm that was Walter. At first, Walter played the role of proud father. He showed her off to neighbors, took pictures holding her, even sang to her once. But behind closed doors, he was still the same man. Loud, angry, cruel. When Clara was 4, I gave birth to Michael. My heart swelled with hope that maybe, just maybe, having 2 children would soften Walter. But it didn't. Walter became worse. His words were sharp, his rules impossible. If the children made noise while he was watching TV, he'd shout until their little bodies shook. Once, when Michael was 6, he cried too loud after scraping his knee. Walter grabbed him by the arm and dragged him to the basement. He locked the door. I stood outside, begging him to let our son out, hearing Michael's screams echo through the dark. It felt like hours before Walter opened that door. Michael came out with tear-streaked cheeks and trembling lips. I hugged him tight that night, whispering that I was sorry, that I'd make it better. But deep down, I knew I was lying to him. Because how could I protect them when I couldn't even protect myself? I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the house we lived in was not a home. It was a prison. And the man I married wasn't a partner. He was a warden. And Clara and Michael were growing up behind the same bars as me.
5.
By the time Clara turned 16, she had learned how to survive in that house. She was smart, sharp-tongued, and fearless in ways I never dared to be. Walter couldn't break her spirit, though he tried. Neighbors started to notice the shouting. They'd glance at me with pity, whisper when Walter strutted past. But no one stepped in. Not the pastor, not the friends we thought we had. Walter had a way of charming people in public. He'd smile, shake hands, act like the perfect family man. And they believed him. Behind closed doors, the truth was different. He threw dishes when he was angry. He called me names that stripped pieces off my soul. I wore makeup to cover bruises, long sleeves in the heat of summer. Clara would sometimes grab my hand, whisper, "We should just leave." But where would we go? I had no money, no family nearby. Walter controlled everything. Then one night, Clara didn't come home. I waited by the window, heart pounding, praying she was safe. Hours passed. The clock ticked past midnight, and when the sun came up, I knew she had run away. When Walter realized, he flew into a rage. He smashed a chair against the wall, shouted that she was ungrateful, cursed her name. But I didn't hear his words. All I could hear was my own breaking heart. Because as much as I wanted Clara to be free, I also knew she had left me behind in the fire. And I feared what Walter would do next, with no one left in that house but me and Michael. Stay with me, because what happened next would change everything. The night Clara ran away, Walter's rage filled every corner of that house. Michael and I sat quiet, holding our breath, waiting for the storm to pass. But storms with Walter never truly passed. They just built into the next one. I tried to keep Michael close, shield him from the worst of it, but Walter's eyes were always sharp, searching for weakness. Food became another weapon. He controlled every dollar, every grocery trip. If I asked for more, he'd say I was wasting his hard-earned money. I took a part-time job at a diner down the road, hiding my tips in a tin can beneath the floorboard of the pantry. Every quarter, every crumpled dollar felt like hope. For months, I saved quietly, thinking maybe I could leave. But hope has a way of drawing danger to itself. Walter found the tin can one evening. I walked into the kitchen and saw him holding it in his hands, his face twisted with that grin I hated more than his anger. Without a word, he tossed it into the fire. The money curled into black ash before I could reach for it. Michael watched it burn too, his fists clenched at his sides. And in that moment, I saw something new in him. Not just fear. Something harder. Something that looked like hatred. I lay awake that night, my body next to Walter's but my mind miles away. The fire had taken more than money. It had burned out the last flicker of belief I had that I could escape. And if I couldn't, then what would happen to my son? That thought haunted me until the next blow came, and this time it wasn't aimed at me. Michael was 15 when he stopped being a boy. Walter made sure of that. It started when Michael began talking back, small things at first. If Walter barked an order, Michael didn't jump fast enough. If Walter insulted me, Michael would mutter under his breath. Walter didn't miss a thing. He cornered Michael one night, shouting until the walls shook. I tried to stand between them, but Walter shoved me aside like I was nothing. Michael's nose bled. His lips split. He staggered back to his room, refusing to let me see him cry. I wanted to call the police, but back then, you didn't just pick up the phone and tell on your husband. Not in our town. Not when Walter's charm made half the neighbors think he was a hard-working family man. The next morning, Michael's face was swollen, but his eyes were steady. He sat across from me at the breakfast table, silent, until he finally said, "One day, I'm leaving. And I'm not coming back." Those words cut through me sharper than Walter's fists ever did. Because I knew Michael meant it. For a while, I clung to his small acts of rebellion, working odd jobs, hiding money in places Walter wouldn't find, looking out for me in ways a child shouldn't have to. But every act of defiance put him in more danger. And the night finally came when he took his chance. Walter had been drinking hard, stumbling through the house with anger dripping off him. Michael whispered to me in the hallway, "Don't stop me this time." He grabbed a bag from under his bed, and before I could say a word, he was gone into the dark. Walter roared when he realized. He punched a hole in the wall, cursed until his throat went raw. But nothing he did could bring Michael back. And I stood there, holding my breath, wondering if losing both my children to freedom was the price of my survival. But what I didn't know was how much darker that house would become once it was just me and Walter. After Michael left, the house grew quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was the quiet of a graveyard. Walter sat in his chair most evenings, beer in hand, muttering under his breath. With no one else left to challenge him, His cruelty turned sharper, heavier. I started writing letters to my children. Letters I never sent. I'd tell them about the flowers that bloomed by the porch, or how I kept their rooms tidy, waiting for them to walk back in. But I knew, deep down, those rooms would stay empty. One night, I walked into the living room and saw Walter tossing photographs into the fireplace. Our wedding pictures. Baby photos of Clara and Michael. Family portraits I had treasured. He didn't even look at me as the flames devoured them. I stood frozen, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling. He wasn't just destroying pictures. He was erasing us. When the last photo curled into ash, he finally turned to me and said, "No one's gonna remember you.
Or them.
All they'll remember is me." And in that moment, I realized he wasn't just trying to break our lives. He was trying to take away the proof we ever existed. That thought shook me to my core. Because if no one remembered, then maybe he'd win. The years crawled by after that. I turned 50, then 60, each birthday marked not by celebration, but by silence. Walter's health began to falter. His hair thinned, his hands trembled, but his voice never lost its bite. By then, I was more ghost than woman. I moved through the house like a shadow, cooking meals he barely touched, answering questions with yes or no. I went to church alone, sat in the back pew, and slipped out before anyone could ask too many questions. The holidays were the hardest. One Christmas, I cooked a small meal, ham, mashed potatoes, green beans. I set the table, hoping against hope that maybe one of the kids would surprise me. I left the porch light on all night, but no one came. I sat across from Walter, who shoveled food into his mouth without a word. When I tried to wish him Merry Christmas, he smirked and said, "Merry nothing. You ain't got no family left." That night, I ate cold leftovers alone in the kitchen while the Christmas tree lights blinked in silence. It was then I realized something bitter and cold. Family wasn't just broken. It was gone. And with Walter's health slipping, I knew the next chapter of this story was going to bring choices I wasn't sure I was strong enough to make. When Walter collapsed one morning, clutching his chest, I didn't rush to his side. I stood still, watching him gasp for air, until instinct finally forced me to call an ambulance. The doctors said he needed care, round the clock. I placed him in a nursing home. For the first time in decades, I walked back into my house alone. The silence was different now, less suffocating, almost like I could breathe again. I visited him, but not out of love. It was duty, plain and cold. He sat in that wheelchair, barking orders at nurses, complaining about the food, acting like the world still owed him something. The neighbors started whispering truths they had ignored for years. I heard one woman say outside the grocery store, "That poor Eleanor. What she must have lived through." One afternoon, Michael came with me to the nursing home. He stood at Walter's bedside, looking down at the man who had beaten him into silence. Walter muttered a weak insult, but Michael didn't flinch. He leaned close to me and whispered, "He doesn't deserve your tears." Those words sank deep into me. For so long, I had cried over Walter. But sitting there, in that sterile room that smelled of bleach and medicine, I realized Michael was right. I didn't owe Walter tears. But what I didn't know yet was how much I would owe myself when his last breath finally came. And that moment was closer than I ever imagined. The call came late at night. Walter was gone. Just like that, the man who had haunted every corner of my life had taken his last breath in a sterile nursing home bed. I sat at the kitchen table after hanging up, staring at the clock on the wall. I waited for grief, for tears, for anything that would make me feel human. But all I felt was nothing. Empty. When the funeral was planned, people nodded politely, but no one offered to help. No neighbors came with casseroles. No pastor called to pray with me. It was as if Walter had already been buried in people's minds long before his body hit the ground. And on the day itself, as I sat in the church, I felt the weight of it. Silence filled every pew. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to speak, not a single person moved. Clara and Michael looked at their shoes. Old friends stared blankly ahead. The silence was louder than any insult Walter had ever thrown at me. Louder than any blow he had landed on my skin. I stood up anyway. My knees shook, but I walked to the podium. I knew in that moment that if I didn't say something, Walter's life would vanish into the air like smoke. But what story do you tell about a man no one wants to remember? And that's when I realized the choice was mine. I could bury the truth with him, or I could finally set it free. My hands trembled as I gripped the podium, staring down at Walter's coffin. My voice cracked at first, but once the words started, they spilled faster than I could stop them. I spoke about Walter's hard work, about his sacrifices, about how he had built a life for his family. None of it was true, but it sounded right. People nodded along, grateful for something polite to carry away with them. As I lied, I remembered the nights I cried in the bathroom with the water running so the children wouldn't hear. I remembered the bruises I covered with powder before church. I remembered Clara's small voice whispering, "We should leave," and Michael's fists clenched tight from the basement shadows. Every memory cut against every word I spoke. Yet I kept lying, because I thought maybe that was the only way to give my children peace. Maybe painting their father as someone better would make their childhood easier to carry. When I glanced at Clara, her brows furrowed. Michael shook his head almost imperceptibly. They knew. My children knew the truth, and now they were watching me twist it into something pretty. My throat tightened. I almost said it. I almost let it all pour out right there, in front of everyone. But then I caught sight of my grandchildren in the pew, their little faces staring up at me. They deserved something softer than the story of a cruel man. So I swallowed the truth one more time. By the time I finished, people sighed with relief. They whispered polite things as if Walter had been a decent man. And I stepped down from that podium with a smile carved into my face like a mask. But once the service was over and the crowd had thinned, Clara and Michael came to me. Clara's eyes burned with anger. Michael's voice trembled when he said, "Mom, why did you lie for him?" And in that moment, I realized the funeral wasn't over. The real reckoning was just beginning. I sat with my children in the quiet fellowship hall after the funeral. The smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air. Clara folded her arms, her jaw tight. Michael leaned against the wall, his eyes wet but hard. "I lied to protect you," I whispered. "I didn't want to drag you through it all again. What good would the truth do now?" Clara's voice broke as she said, "It would have done good for us, Mom. We needed to hear you say it out loud." Michael nodded. "We spent our lives pretending it wasn't happening, pretending we were okay. And now you're still pretending." The words hit me like a slap. They weren't wrong. I thought silence had been survival, but maybe it had been poison too. Maybe the silence had passed from me to them, shaping how they lived, how they loved. I reached for their hands, my voice trembling. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was keeping the family together." Michael squeezed my hand. "The family was already broken, Mom. We just needed you to admit it." His tears fell then, and mine followed. The weight of 5 decades of silence pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. And that's when I knew what I had to do.
For them. For me. For all the years we lost.
That night, back at Clara's house, I told them everything. Every bruise, every scream, every dollar burned. I didn't spare the ugly details. For the first time in my life, I told the truth out loud. Clara cried openly, her head in her hands. Michael sat stiff at first, then softened, his shoulders shaking. I expected them to blame me, to resent me for not leaving. But instead, they listened. When I finished, the room was heavy with silence. Clara finally looked at me, tears streaking her face, and said, "You should have never had to carry that alone." Michael's voice cracked. "You're still here, Mom. That means something. You made it through." For the first time, I didn't feel like a coward. I felt like a survivor. Clara reached for my hand. "Let's hold a memorial. Not for him. For you. For everything you endured."
Her words stunned me.
A memorial for me? I had spent my life invisible, my story buried under Walter's shadow. And now my children wanted to honor me instead of him. For the first time in years, I felt seen. But even as I smiled through fresh tears, I couldn't shake one thought. What if Walter wasn't done with me yet? A week later, Clara and Michael invited close family and a few trusted friends to Clara's backyard. The sun was setting, painting the sky pink and gold. There was no coffin, no preacher, no hymns. Just laughter, tears, and stories. But this time, the stories weren't about Walter.
They were about me.
Clara read aloud one of the letters I had written years ago, but never sent. My words trembled in her voice. How much I loved them, how sorry I was for not protecting them better, how I prayed every night they would find peace. Michael stood tall, his hand on my shoulder. He told everyone how I had worked myself raw to keep food on the table, how I had endured what no woman should have to endure. For once, I wasn't just a shadow in the corner. I was the heart of the story. The tears I cried that evening were different. They weren't from fear or shame. They were from being seen, truly seen, after a lifetime of silence. Later, when the guests left and the night grew quiet, I walked alone to Walter's grave. I stood over that cold stone, the lies of the eulogy still clinging to the air, and whispered, "I forgave you, but you will never define me again." The wind rustled the grass, and for the first time, I felt light. Life had taught me something brutal but true. Pretending may keep the peace, but it also buries the truth. And buried truth poisons everything it touches. Speaking it, no matter how late, is the only way to heal. I turned back toward the warm glow of Clara's house, where my grandchildren's laughter drifted through the windows. My family was no longer broken. It was healing. But just as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed an envelope sticking out of the mailbox. My name written across it in shaky handwriting. I picked it up, my heart pounding. The return address made my breath catch. It wasn't from a neighbor. It wasn't from family. It was from the nursing home. And in that instant, I realized Walter's story might not be finished after all. Stay with me, because the truth inside that envelope was about to change everything I thought I knew.